The silence of the Back Bay brownstone was thick, heavy with the scent of expensive cedar and something else, a faint, unfamiliar cologne. Alaric stood in the shadowy hallway, his hand frozen on his loosened tie, as the unmistakable sounds of tangled breath and whispered promises drifted down from his own bedroom. Through the crack of the mahogany door, he didn't just see his wife's skin illuminated by the street lamp. He saw the face of the man burying his hands in her hair. Julian St. James, his biggest corporate rival. In a fraction of a second, a loving marriage dissolved into a crime scene of corporate espionage and intimate betrayal. Alaric didn't scream. He didn't kick the door. He simply stepped back into the shadows, a cold, calculating venom replacing the blood in his veins. If the quiet, systematic destruction of those who mistake your love for weakness speaks to you, stay with me. The rain in Boston had a way of washing the warmth out of the world, leaving behind a stark, grayscale city. Alaric stood in the foyer of his four-story Back Bay brownstone, shaking the dampness from his bespoke Tom Ford suit. The house was supposed to be empty. Alethea had texted him 2 hours ago. Meeting ran late at the preservation site. Drinks with the board. Don't wait up. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays were for late nights at Bennett and Hayes, drowning in the tedious due diligence of the pending Vanguard-Sterling merger, a deal so controversial it was already drawing federal scrutiny. But a sudden migraine had forced Alaric to hand the reins to his junior partner and retreat to the quiet sanctuary of his home. Except it wasn't quiet. Alaric paused, his hand hovering over the keypad of the alarm system. It was disarmed. He glanced at the antique velvet sofa in the sitting room. Draped over its armrest was a charcoal cashmere trench coat. It wasn't his. Alaric's heart performed a slow, sickening thud against his ribs. He didn't call out. 7 years of dissecting hostile takeovers and unearthing corporate fraud had trained him to move in silence, to observe before reacting. He unlaced his Oxford shoes, stepping onto the Persian rug in his socks. The house smelled of Alethea's signature diptyque candle, sandalwood and fig, but layered beneath it was the sharp, peppery tang of an unfamiliar men's cologne. A muffled sound drifted down the curved oak staircase. A soft gasp, a rhythmic creak of floorboards. Alaric ascended the stairs, the shadows of the hallway clinging to him like a second skin. With every step, the sounds grew more distinct. The murmur of a deep voice. The unmistakable, breathy sigh of his wife. When he reached the master suite, the heavy mahogany door was ajar, just enough to cast a sliver of golden lamplight across the hallway floor. He stopped. He didn't need to look, but some masochistic instinct compelled him to press his face near the gap. Through the opening, the reflection in the vanity mirror told the entire, devastating story. Alethea, her pale skin glowing in the dim light, her hands clutching the designer bedsheets they had bought together in Milan. And above her, tracing the line of her jaw with an almost possessive arrogance, was a man Alaric recognized instantly. Julian St. James. The air in Alaric's lungs turned to glass, shattering with every attempted breath. Julian wasn't just another man in Boston's elite circles. He was the head of the private equity firm aggressively trying to hostile take over Vanguard. He was the enemy at the gates of Alaric's career. A chilling realization washed over the betrayal. On the nightstand, right next to where Julian had tossed his watch, sat Alethea's open laptop. It was plugged into the home network. The same network Alaric used to access Bennett and Hayes secured servers. This wasn't just an affair. It was an extraction. Alaric's fists clenched until his knuckles turned bone white. The impulse to kick the door open, to drag Julian out by his hair, roared in his ears. But then, the lawyer in him, the apex predator of the boardroom, woke up. If he stormed in now, he was just a jealous husband creating a messy domestic dispute. Julian would spin it, the firm would panic, and the merger would collapse. No, men like Julian didn't deserve a crime of passion. They deserved absolute, systematic annihilation. Slowly, without making a single sound, Alaric stepped back from the door. He retreated down the stairs, picked up his damp shoes, and walked out the front door into the freezing, relentless rain. He stood on the sidewalk, looking up at his own bedroom window, and pulled out his phone. He didn't call his wife. He dialed a number he had sworn never to use unless everything was on the line. "Odette," Alaric said, his voice terrifyingly calm against the storm. "I need your services. Tonight." The morning sun spilled across the quartz countertops of the kitchen, casting long, deceivingly warm shadows. Alaric stood by the espresso machine. The mechanical whir and hiss the only sounds in the unervingly quiet house. He had spent the night in a luxury hotel downtown, returning at dawn just in time to slip into his study and feign an early start to the workday. His tailored suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, but beneath the armor of his corporate attire, his muscles were coiled tighter than industrial steel. Alethea patted down the stairs a few minutes later. She wore one of his old dress shirts, the crisp white cotton grazing her bare thighs. It was an image that, just 24 hours ago, would have sparked a quiet, domestic warmth in his chest. Now, it made his stomach turn. He knew exactly whose hands had touched that skin mere hours before. "You're up early," she murmured, her voice husky with sleep as she walked toward the island. She smelled of her signature fig perfume and the expensive botanical body wash she used. The peppery cologne from last night had been thoroughly scrubbed away. "The Vanguard deal doesn't sleep," Alaric replied, pushing a freshly brewed cappuccino across the marble counter toward her. His voice was a flat, even baritone. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the delicate gold chain around her neck, analyzing the pulse beating rhythmically at her throat. "How was the preservation board?" he asked, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. The bitter liquid tasted like ash. Alethea picked up the mug, wrapping both hands around it to absorb the heat. "Exhausting," she sighed, a flawless picture of a weary professional. "The city council is pushing back on the zoning permits for the library. We were at the site until 8, and then I had to soothe ruffled feathers over drinks until nearly midnight. I came home and practically collapsed." She lied with the grace of a trained operative. There was no stutter, no nervous ticking of her fingers. Only a slight, almost imperceptible shift in her gaze toward the window gave her away. A tell Alaric had only ever noticed when she was trying to hide how much she had spent at a charity auction. Now, she was using it to hide high treason. "I'm sorry I missed you," Alaric said smoothly. "My migraine flared up. I crashed in the guest room, so I wouldn't wake you when my alarm went off." "You work too hard, Rick," she said softly, offering a sympathetic smile that made his blood run cold. While she took a sip of her coffee, Alaric slid his iPad across the counter, unlocking it with his thumb. To Alethea, it looked like he was scanning the morning edition of the Wall Street Journal. In reality, he was accessing the encrypted administrative logs of their home's broadband router. Bennett and Hayes had installed military-grade firewalls on his work devices, but the home network itself was a vulnerability he had always warned her about. His eyes scanned the raw data lines, his legal mind translating the timestamps and packet sizes. There it was. At 9:14 p.m. the previous night, right around the time he had been standing in the freezing rain on the sidewalk, a massive, encrypted data packet had been funneled from Alethea's IP address to an external, mass server. Julian hadn't just come to conquer Alaric's wife. He had come to hollow out Alaric's career from the inside. Alethea had given him the keys to the kingdom while tangled in their Milanese bedsheets. Alaric locked the iPad and slipped it into his leather briefcase. He walked around the kitchen island, his heart beating a slow, terrifying rhythm. He stopped in front of his wife, leaning down to press a lingering kiss against her forehead. It required every ounce of discipline he had cultivated over a decade of brutal litigation not to wrap his hands around her neck. "Have a good day at the firm," Alethea whispered, closing her eyes into the kiss. "I will," Alaric promised, his voice a chilling whisper she completely misinterpreted. Things are finally starting to get interesting. He walked out the door, leaving her in the sunlit kitchen, entirely unaware that the countdown to her destruction had already begun. The Velvet Room lived up to its name. Tucked beneath street level in a discreet alley off Newberry Street, it was a cavern of mahogany, dim amber lighting, and the hushed murmurs of Boston's elite negotiating in the shadows. Alaric sat in a corner booth, nursing a neat Macallan 18. He hadn't touched it. The amber liquid simply served as a prop for normalcy. At precisely 8 p.m., Odette slid into the leather booth opposite him. She wore a sharp, asymmetrical black blazer, her dark hair cut in a severe bob that framed eyes as calculating as a sniper's. Odette didn't do pleasantries. She was the city's premier crisis PR specialist, the woman billionaires called when there was blood on the boardroom floor and the press was circling. "You look like a man who just lost a war, Alaric," she noted, her voice a low, raspy purr. She signaled the waiter with a flick of her wrist. "Vodka martini dry, and whatever he's pretending to drink." "I haven't lost," Alaric replied, his tone devoid of inflection. "I'm just drafting the terms of surrender for the other side." Odette raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "The Vanguard merger? I heard whispers the SEC might be taking a look. Did Bennett and Hayes finally bite off more than they can chew?" "The merger is structurally sound," Alaric said, leaning forward, the ambient noise of the club fading into a dull roar. "The problem is a leak. An internal one, targeted directly at my home network." He placed a sleek, black USB drive on the mahogany table between them. He didn't push it toward her. He let it sit there, a dark monolith of betrayal. "Julian St. James," Alaric stated. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. "He's trying to tank the Vanguard deal by extracting our due diligence files. And he's using my wife to do it." Odette's gaze flicked from the drive to Alaric's face. For a fraction of a second, genuine surprise registered in her cool eyes before it was swiftly replaced by a predatory gleam. Alethea, the conservation angel of Boston, sleeping with Julian St. James to steal corporate secrets? That is Shakespearean. "It's a liability," Alaric corrected coldly. He refused to let the emotional weight of it enter the conversation. He couldn't afford to bleed right now. "Julian downloaded a packet of files from my home router last night while he was in my bed. What he doesn't know yet is that those files were encrypted decoys. He thinks he has the kill switch for my merger. I need to make sure that when he presses it, it blows his own empire to pieces." Odette picked up the USB drive, turning it over in her manicured fingers. The dim light caught the metallic edge. "You don't want a divorce lawyer, Alaric. You want an executioner. If we play this right, Julian goes down for federal cyber espionage. But Alethea," she paused, watching him carefully to gauge his breaking point. "She goes down as the accomplice. You understand that? If we spin this narrative, her reputation, her career, her pristine little life, it all burns with him." Alaric looked down at his glass. He thought of the crisp white shirt Alethea wore that morning, the flawless, sickening lie over coffee. The hollow ache in his chest had finally crystallized into something sharp and absolute. "I want them to feel safe," Alaric said, lifting his eyes to meet Odette's. They were as dark and unyielding as the bottom of the ocean. "I want Julian to think he outsmarted me. I want Alethea to think she got away with it. And then, Odette, I want you to control the narrative when I drop the guillotine." Odette smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her red lips. She dropped the drive into her designer bag, the clasp snapping shut with a finality that echoed in the quiet booth. "Consider the narrative yours, Alaric. Let's build a monster." The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2 in the morning, its heavy chime vibrating through the silent floorboards of the Back Bay brownstone. Inside his mahogany-paneled study, Alaric sat bathed in the sterile, blue glow of 3 high-resolution monitors. The rest of the house was submerged in darkness, but in this room, a meticulous execution was being planned. His fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard with surgical precision. To catch a corporate predator like Julian St. James, a simple fake document wouldn't suffice. Julian had a team of analysts who would tear apart any amateur forgery in seconds. Alaric had to weave a masterpiece of deception. He spent hours extracting legitimate, harmless financial histories from the Vanguard files, painstakingly splicing them with fabricated, catastrophic risk assessments for the upcoming third quarter. He drafted phantom liabilities, buried hidden debts in dense legalese, and created a fictitious SEC inquiry trail that looked entirely damning. It was a brilliant, toxic mosaic. To anyone reading it, The Vanguard merger appeared to be a toxic asset disguised as a gold mine. If Julian acted on this information, if he leveraged it to spook the board or leak it to the financial press, he would be using stolen, radioactive material that didn't actually exist, and the act of stealing it would trigger federal alarms. Alaric paused, rubbing his tired eyes. The faint, rhythmic sound of water drumming against tile echoed through the ceiling vents. Alethea was taking a late-night shower. The intimacy of the sound, the domestic routine they had shared for 7 years, sent a sharp, phantom pain through his chest. He remembered a time when he would have closed the laptop, walked upstairs, and joined her under the warm spray, washing away the stress of the corporate world. Now, she was washing away the guilt of another man's touch, preparing to slip back into the bed of the husband she was actively betraying. Alaric forced his focus back to the screen. The vulnerability of his heart was a luxury he could no longer afford. He created a new, password-protected folder on the home network's shared drive. He named it with deliberate, irresistible bait. Vanguard_Q3_risk_assessment_confidential_Duke_not_distribute. Then, he did the most difficult thing he had ever done in his career as a lawyer. He deliberately weakened the encryption. He didn't make it obvious. He layered it behind a secondary firewall, but he left a specific backdoor open, a digital breadcrumb trail that Alethea, who possessed his secondary passwords for household emergencies, could easily bypass if she was looking for it. It was a digital honeypot, rigged with tracking software Odette had provided, designed to ping his phone the exact millisecond the files were copied to an external drive. The water stopped running upstairs. Soft footsteps padded across the master bedroom floor directly above his head. She was getting into bed. She was waiting for him to finally sleep so she could begin her work. Alaric stood up from his leather chair. He didn't close the laptop. He left it open on the desk, the screen glowing invitingly in the dark room, the bait perfectly set. He walked to the heavy oak door of his study and, instead of locking it as he usually did when handling sensitive M&A files, he left it open just a crack. It was an invitation, a silent, deadly welcome to the thief in his own home. Alaric walked out into the hallway, his face a mask of absolute calm, knowing that by morning, his wife would seal her own fate. The notification had vibrated against Alaric's thigh at exactly 3:14 a.m. A silent, digital confirmation that the trap had been sprung. Now, 20 hours later, the phantom echo of that vibration still hummed in his veins as he sat across from his wife at their sprawling mahogany dining table. Alethea had insisted on cooking, a rare occurrence. She had spent the evening preparing seared scallops and a delicate saffron risotto, an overcompensation born entirely of a guilty conscience. She wore a simple silk slip dress, her hair pulled back in a loose, elegant chignon. To any outside observer, looking through the rain-streaked windows of the Back Bay brownstone, it was a portrait of domestic bliss. But the air between them was thick, suffocating beneath the weight of everything left unsaid. "The risotto is excellent," Alaric said, his voice smooth, betraying nothing of the absolute zero temperature in his chest. He took a slow sip of the crisp chablis he had poured. "Thank you," Alethea murmured. She was pushing a scallop around her porcelain plate, her appetite clearly non-existent. "I felt like we needed a quiet night. Just us. You've been so consumed by the Vanguard merger lately. I feel like I barely see you." The audacity of her statement almost made him smile. Almost. Instead, he studied the faint shadows beneath her eyes. She was exhausted. Lying was a labor-intensive endeavor, especially when you were funneling stolen corporate data to your husband's greatest rival. "It's the nature of the beast," Alaric replied, setting his silver fork down with deliberate care. "Vanguard is the crown jewel. There are forces trying very hard to tear it apart from the inside out. But I assure you, Alethea, my defenses are perfectly in place." Alethea's gaze flicked up, meeting his eyes for a fraction of a second before darting away. Her fingers tightened around the delicate stem of her wine glass. Beneath the table, hidden in the depths of her leather tote bag, was a silver flash drive containing the encrypted files she had downloaded in the dead of night. She had convinced herself it was just leverage for Julian, a way to force a settlement, not destroy her husband. Julian had promised her that. But looking at Alaric's tired, devoted face, a sickening wave of nausea washed over her. She loved Alaric. She really did. He was her anchor, the man who had built this beautiful, stable life for them. But Julian was a storm, an addiction she couldn't break, whispering promises of a thrilling, unbridled existence. Now, the two worlds were colliding, and the resulting shrapnel was tearing her apart from the inside. "Is it safe?" she asked, her voice dropping to a precarious whisper. "The deal, I mean. Are you protected?" Alaric leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished wood. He looked at the woman he had vowed to cherish, the woman who had effortlessly shattered his reality. The urge to reach across the table, to grab her wrist and demand the brutal truth, was a physical ache. But Odette's warning echoed clearly in his mind. Let them feel safe. "I have absolute control over the situation," Alaric said, his tone laced with a dark, lethal double meaning she was entirely blind to. "Whoever is trying to sabotage me will find that they've walked into a locked room with no exits. You don't need to worry about a thing, darling." He reached across the table, covering her trembling, icy hand with his own. Alethea forced a fragile smile, but a single tear slipped free, tracing a hot path down her cheek. She quickly brushed it away, blaming the steam from the food, but Alaric knew the truth. He was looking at the tears of a ghost mourning the death of her own marriage, entirely unaware that her husband was the one patiently digging the grave. The first tremor didn't start with an earthquake, it started with a whisper. In the soundproofed glass conference room of her PR firm overlooking Boston Harbor, Odette tapped her manicured fingernail against her phone screen. She had spent the morning trading encrypted messages with a ghostwriter for the Financial Times and a hungry blogger at Bloomberg. The narrative she spun was delicate, entirely speculative, but laced with enough anonymous insider terminology to smell like blood in the water. Rumors of liquidity issues at St. James Capital. Whispers of a federal inquiry into their recent offshore acquisitions. By noon, the financial ticker running across the bottom of Odette's muted television showed Julian's flagship fund dipping by 3%. It was a minor fluctuation to a layman, but to a shark like Julian, it was a harpoon to the gills. Odette smiled, taking a slow sip of her sparkling water. The psychological warfare had officially commenced. Across town, in the sterile, high-priced anonymity of a suite at the Archer Hotel, the romance had completely evaporated. Julian St. James paced the length of the room, his tie discarded, his usually immaculate hair running wild from his agitated hands. The television in the corner was tuned to a financial news network, the volume low but the scrolling red numbers screaming at him. Alethea sat on the edge of the unmade king-sized bed, clutching the hotel bathrobe tightly around herself. The air conditioning suddenly felt freezing. She had come here expecting the intoxicating escape Julian usually provided, a reprieve from the suffocating guilt waiting for her at the Back Bay brownstone. Instead, she had walked into a war room. "It's not enough, Thea," Julian snapped, stopping his pacing to glare at the silver flash drive she had placed on the glass coffee table. "This risk assessment file is great, it's damning, but I need the board's internal communications. I need to know exactly how Bennett and Hayes plans to mitigate this when I leak it. Without their defense strategy, Alaric will just spin it and recover." Alethea shrank back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Julian, I can't. You don't understand. Alaric, he was talking about the deal last night. He said his defenses are perfectly in place. He looked right at me. I think he knows something is wrong." "He doesn't know anything," Julian scoffed, stepping closer and leaning over her. The peppery cologne that once intoxicated her now smelled distinctly of desperation and threat. "He's an arrogant corporate drone who thinks his fortress is impenetrable. You have the access codes. You promised me you would help me tear him down. I promised to help you get leverage, not to become a corporate spy." Alethea's voice cracked, the reality of her felony finally piercing her delusion. "If I go back into that network, if I push too hard, the firm's IT department will flag it. I could go to federal prison, Julian. Julian knelt in front of her, his hands gripping her bare knees with a force that bordered on painful. The charming, attentive lover was gone, replaced by a ruthless opportunist bleeding out on the financial floor. Listen to me, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. My stock is taking a hit today. Someone is leaking garbage to the press, and I need the Vanguard kill shot to stabilize my investors. You're going to go home. You're going to wait until your husband is asleep, and you're going to get me those emails. Or everything we've done here, everything you've risked, is for nothing. Alethea stared into his eyes, a cold, terrifying clarity washing over her. She wasn't his muse, nor was she the great love of his life. She was a skeleton key, and the moment she stopped unlocking doors for him, he would discard her. She was trapped in a burning building, having lit the match herself, while her husband waited patiently in the smoke. The skyline of Boston was a grid of indifferent lights against a starless, obsidian sky. High above the sleeping city, in the corner office of Bennett and Hayes, Alaric sat bathed in the sterile glow of a single monitor. The heavy mahogany door was locked. On the glass desk, a burner phone sat on speaker, the line utterly silent save for the faint, rhythmic breathing of Odette on the other end. They were hunting ghosts in the machine. At 1:42 a.m., a line of code flashed green across the black screen. She's in, Odette murmured, her voice a dry rasp that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Alaric didn't blink. He watched the digital footprint of his wife navigate the labyrinth of his home network. Following Julian's desperate ultimatum, Alethea had crept out of their Milanese sheets, bypassed the weakened firewall Alaric had deliberately left exposed, and located the new, heavily encrypted folder labeled Vanguard or internal. It was a masterful fabrication, a collection of fake emails supposedly detailing Bennett and Hayes' panic over the earlier risk assessment. It was exactly what Julian demanded. It was also a federal crime waiting to happen. She's compressing the files, Odette reported, reading the telemetry from her own remote terminal. 50 megabytes. 100. She's moving fast. Alaric stared at the blinking cursor. Behind the alphanumeric codes and IP addresses, he pictured Alethea sitting at his desk in the brownstone. He imagined her trembling hands, the guilt gnawing at her throat, the suffocating fear of being caught. For a fleeting, agonizing second, a ghost of the man who loved her screamed for her to stop. He wanted the keystrokes to cease. He wanted her to close the laptop, crawl back into bed, and choose him. If she stopped now, it was just an affair. It was a broken heart, but not a broken life. The data transfer paused. Hold on, Odette said, a hint of genuine tension piercing her professional armor. The packet flow stopped. She's hesitating. Silence stretched in the executive office, thick and heavy. Alaric held his breath. In the quiet dark of the Back Bay study, miles away, Alethea was staring at the send button, the weight of her entire existence balanced on the edge of a single click. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. Then, the screen flared with a rapid cascade of data. Transfer resumed, Odette announced, the clinical detachment returning to her tone. The packet has left your router. We are tracking the destination. Alaric let out a slow, measured exhale. The microscopic ember of hope he hadn't realized he was holding on to turned instantly to ash. She had made her choice. She had chosen Julian. Target IP acquired, Odette continued, her keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. It's bouncing through a proxy in the Caymans, but the terminus is a private server registered to a shell LLC. I ran the shell an hour ago. It's a holding company directly tied to St. James Capital. We have him, Alaric. We have them both. The trap was primed. The explosive was wired, and Julian St. James was unknowingly holding the detonator. Lock down the home network, Alaric instructed, his voice as hollow and cold as the vacuum of space. Seal the back door. Make it look like a routine automated security patch. She won't be able to get back in. Done. What's our next move? Alaric looked out at the city, the reflection of his own empty eyes staring back at him from the reinforced glass. The husband had officially died. Only the executioner remained. Tomorrow night is the Preservation Society Gala, Alaric said softly. Julian will be there. Alethea will be wearing my ring. We let them celebrate their victory. And then, Odette, we burn them to the ground. The Metropolitan Gallery was a sea of silk, diamonds, and suffocating hypocrisy. The annual Preservation Society Gala was Boston's premier charity event, a place where the city's elite gathered beneath vaulted ceilings to write tax-deductible checks and trade whispered secrets. Alaric stood near a towering Roman marble statue, a flute of vintage champagne resting lightly in his hand, projecting the aura of an untouchable corporate titan. Beside him, Alethea was a vision in emerald green satin, her hand resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. To the flashing cameras of the society photographers, they were the undisputed king and queen of the Back Bay. Only Alaric knew that the queen had already surrendered the castle to the enemy. Across the crowded floor, holding court among a group of nervous tech investors, was Julian St. James. He looked infuriatingly triumphant, exuding the smug confidence of a man who believed he had just acquired the final piece of the Vanguard puzzle. Julian's eyes cut through the crowd, landing squarely on Alethea. It was a brief, electric look, a proprietary sweep of his gaze that claimed her right in front of her husband. Alaric felt the phantom burn of the betrayal deep in his chest, but he did not flinch. He simply took a slow sip of his champagne, observing the microscopic tightening of Alethea's grip on his tuxedo sleeve. She felt the weight of Julian's stare. A faint flush crept up her elegant neck, a physical manifestation of her guilt colliding with a dangerous thrill. He seems to be in terribly good spirits tonight, Alaric noted casually, leaning in so his lips barely brushed Alethea's ear. Julian, I mean, especially considering the rumors circulating about his flagship fund. Alethea stiffened, almost imperceptibly. Rumors, she echoed, her voice lacking its usual smooth, melodic cadence. Just whispers on the street, Alaric replied, his eyes locked on Julian from across the room. But in our world, Alethea, a whisper is all it takes to start a very public execution. He watched his wife swallow hard, the emerald satin rustling as she shifted her weight. She thought she had saved Julian last night by stealing the internal communications. She thought she was the unseen heroine of their twisted little love story, providing the shield Julian needed to weather the storm. A few yards away, standing near the grand sweeping staircase, Odette materialized from the shadows. She wore a sleek, silver gown that looked more like liquid armor, holding a martini glass and looking utterly bored by the surrounding opulence. She caught Alaric's eye and gave a fraction of a nod. The trap was fully locked. Julian's servers had decrypted the fake files that morning, and Odette's surveillance confirmed he was preparing to weaponize them against the Vanguard merger at first light. The string quartet shifted into a sweeping, dramatic waltz. Julian, emboldened by his perceived victory, detached himself from his circle and glided across the polished marble floor directly toward them. Alaric, Alethea. Julian greeted smoothly, extending a hand that Alaric shook with a grip just firm enough to register as a physical threat. A stunning event, as always. Alethea, your work with the committee is truly unmatched. Thank you, Julian, Alethea managed to say, her eyes darting frantically between the two men. The air around them was thick enough to choke on. I hear congratulations might soon be in order for the Vanguard merger, Julian said, his smile sharp and predatory. Though I suppose in M&A, one never really knows if the foundation is rotting until the walls come crashing down. It was a brazen taunt. Julian was parading his stolen knowledge, rubbing it in Alaric's face under the guise of pleasant conversation. The sheer arrogance of it solidified the ice in Alaric's veins. He looked at Julian, then down at his wife, whose face had gone dangerously pale beneath the chandelier light. You're entirely right, Julian, Alaric said, his voice dropping to a smooth, lethal baritone that carried perfectly over the swelling music. But I find that if you design the collapse yourself, the debris only crushes the people standing in the wrong place. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features before his massive ego suppressed it. He gave a slight, dismissive bow and retreated toward the bar. Alaric turned back to his wife, reaching out to gently adjust the diamond necklace at her throat. His touch sent a visible, terrified shiver down her spine. The execution orders were signed. Tomorrow, the world they knew would burn. The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Bennett and Hayes boardroom like a sharpened blade, offering no warmth, only a harsh, unforgiving clarity. It was 8:30 a.m. Alaric sat at the head of the long oak table, his hands perfectly still over a leather-bound folio. The room was empty save for him, the quiet hum of the air conditioning the only sound. 3 blocks away, in the gleaming steel tower of St. James Capitol, Julian was feeling the intoxicating rush of absolute power. He sat behind his sleek glass desk, his finger hovering over the mouse. On his screen was an email addressed to the regional director of the SEC, blind copied to the 3 most ruthless financial journalists on the eastern seaboard. Attached were the files Alethea had stolen, the supposed Vanguard internal communications. Julian didn't even read them thoroughly. His arrogance assured him that whatever Alethea had risked her marriage to extract was exactly the kill shot he needed. With a triumphant smirk, he clicked send. In the Bennett and Hayes boardroom, Alaric's burner phone vibrated against the polished wood. A single text from Odette illuminated the screen, payload delivered. The detonator is yours. Alaric didn't smile. He simply typed a one-word reply, execute. What Julian St. James did not understand about the digital files he had just broadcasted to the federal government was that they were not merely fake documents. They were a Trojan horse, embedded with a highly illegal, military-grade tracking beacon. The moment Julian hit send, the files automatically verified their origin, not from Bennett and Hayes, but from a proxy server registered to Julian's own holding company. Within 60 seconds of Julian's email leaving his outbox, Odette unleashed hell. She didn't wait for the SEC to read Julian's message. Instead, Odette simultaneously blasted a meticulously crafted press release to every major news outlet globally. The headline did not mention Vanguard. It read, St. James Capitol investigated for massive corporate cyber espionage ring. The release detailed how Julian's firm had been using illegal wiretaps and targeted hacking to steal encrypted data from top-tier law firms across Boston. As proof, Odette's ghostwriters provided the exact IP addresses and server logs of the Cayman proxy Julian had used the night before, information Alaric had legally obtained when the proxy breached his own home network. The reversal was instantaneous and violently catastrophic. Alaric picked up the remote and turned on the massive flat screen embedded in the boardroom wall. The financial news network, which only yesterday had been whispering about Julian's liquidity, was now blaring breaking news alerts in bright red banners. Federal agents raid St. James Capitol. The camera cut to a live helicopter feed. Down on the street level, dark SUVs with government plates were aggressively pulling up to the glass doors of Julian's building. Agents and windbreakers were already streaming into the lobby. Julian hadn't just exposed himself to a lawsuit. By transmitting the manipulated files to the SEC, he had committed a federal felony, weaponizing stolen data on a government server. Alaric watched the ticker at the bottom of the screen. St. James Capitol stock didn't just dip. It went into a terrifying, unrecoverable freefall. The empire Julian had built over a decade was evaporating in minutes. His phone vibrated again. It was a call from Alethea. She must have seen the news. She must be watching the man she had betrayed her husband for being dragged out of his glass tower in handcuffs. Alaric stared at her name glowing on the screen, the peppery scent of Julian's cologne from that first night suddenly burning in his memory. He let it ring. The trap had snapped shut, crushing the predator, but the prey trapped inside the cage with him was now entirely at Alaric's mercy. The war was over. Now, it was time for the execution. The scratch of the Mont Blanc pen against the heavy parchment sounded impossibly loud in the executive suite of Bennett and Hayes. Alaric signed his name with the same practiced, fluid motion he used to authorize a dry cleaning bill. Beside him, The CEO of Vanguard exhaled a breath he had seemingly been holding for 6 months. Handshakes were exchanged. Champagne was poured. The billion-dollar merger, the very deal Julian St. James had sacrificed his freedom to destroy, was officially closed. Alaric accepted a crystal flute, his reflection caught in the glass. A man who had just won the most vicious war of his career. Yet, as the vintage champagne touched his lips, he felt absolutely nothing. Miles away, in the pristine solitude of the Back Bay brownstone, the silence was shattering. Alethea sat on the edge of the antique velvet sofa, the same sofa where Julian had carelessly tossed his coat days prior. Her knees were pulled tightly to her chest, her eyes wide, bloodshot, and fixed on the television screen. The news cycle was relentless. Footage of Julian, stripped of his bespoke tie and flanked by grim-faced federal agents, played on an endless, agonizing loop. The Chiron beneath his bewildered, furious face blared in bright crimson. Private equity so, indicted in Fed sting over forged M&A documents. Forged. The word echoed in Alethea's mind, a physical blow that knocked the remaining breath from her lungs. The anchor's voice droned on, detailing how the leaked documents were a sophisticated honeypot, a digital trap containing a radioactive tracking beacon that instantly alerted authorities the moment they were transmitted to a government server. Alethea's trembling hand covered her mouth as the horrifying geometry of the situation finally aligned. The unprotected folder on the network. The weakened firewall that she had so easily bypassed. The chillingly calm dinner where Alaric had looked her dead in the eye and promised that his enemies were walking into a locked room with no exits. Alaric had known. He had known before she even opened the laptop in the dark. He had sat across from her, eaten the food she cooked, kissed her forehead, and patiently guided her hand right onto the detonator. She pulled her phone from her pocket, staring at the shattered screen. She had called Julian 7 times since the raid began. Each call went straight to the sterile, robotic voice of his voicemail. Julian hadn't loved her. To him, she was merely a skeleton key, a foolish, easily manipulated woman with high-level clearance. And to Alaric? To the man who had vowed to cherish and protect her? She was nothing more than the bait he strung up to catch a predator. She looked around the meticulously curated living room. The Persian rugs, the dying diptyque candles, the architectural models she had proudly displayed on the mantel. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a mausoleum. She was entirely alone, trapped in the wreckage of her own catastrophic hubris. The federal agents had Julian, but Odette's carefully crafted press release had notably omitted Alethea's name. Alaric was too proud, too protective of his own image, to endure the public humiliation of his wife being marched out in handcuffs. No, his punishment would be far more intimate, far more devastating. The heavy, metallic click of the front door unlocking severed the quiet. The sound of Alaric's Oxford shoes stepping into the foyer echoed like the steady beat of an executioner's drum. Alethea didn't run. There was nowhere left to hide. She simply sat in the ruins of her life, her heart hammering against her ribs, waiting for the ghost of her husband to walk into the room. The click of the deadbolt was the loudest sound Alethea had ever heard. Alaric stepped into the foyer, his posture perfectly straight, the Vanguard merger securely locked in his leather briefcase. He didn't rush. He meticulously unbuttoned his tailored wool coat, draped it over the antique coat rack, and walked into the living room. Alethea was still sitting on the velvet sofa, illuminated only by the muted, flickering light of the television screen where Julian's bewildered face remained frozen in the news Chiron. Alaric stopped a few feet away. He looked at her not with rage, but with the clinical detachment of a forensic accountant surveying a bankrupt ledger. "You knew," Alethea whispered. The words scraped against her dry throat, barely audible over the hum of the central heating. "From the very beginning. You knew." "I came home early last Tuesday," Alaric said, his voice a flat, even baritone that offered no comfort, no anchor. "My migraine was severe. I walked through the front door and heard the two of you upstairs. I smelled his cologne on this very sofa." Alethea squeezed her eyes shut, a jagged sob tearing through her chest. The humiliation was absolute, a physical weight crushing her lungs. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you stop me? Stop you? Alaric tilted his head, a microscopic shift in his rigid posture. Alethea, you are a brilliant, capable woman. You invited my greatest corporate rival into our bed, and then you willingly bypassed my security protocols to steal my firm's data. If I had stopped you that night, you would have just found another way to give him what he wanted. I couldn't afford that risk. Vanguard was too important. So you used me, she gasped, the tears finally spilling over, ruining her immaculate makeup. You let me commit a federal crime. You turned me into a decoy. I didn't turn you into anything, Alaric corrected coldly. He stepped closer, the ambient light catching the sharp angles of his jaw. I simply laid out the bait. You chose to take it. You chose him, Alethea. I merely ensured that when you pulled the trigger, the gun was pointed at his head, not mine. Alethea looked up at the man she had married. The brilliant, devoted lawyer who had spent 7 years building a fortress around them. She had always thought his intellect was their greatest shield. She never imagined what it would feel like when those weapons were turned on her. He didn't love me, she confessed, her voice breaking into pathetic, fractured pieces. She was no longer a sophisticated conservation architect. She was a terrified ghost haunting her own life. Julian. He just wanted the files. When the FBI raided his office, he wouldn't even answer my calls. I know, Alaric said softly. For a fraction of a second, the executioner vanished, and the ghost of the husband who had loved her flickered in his dark eyes. It was a fleeting glimpse of profound, unhealed agony. But I did. That was your miscalculation, Alethea. You traded a man who would have burned the world for you, for a man who burned you to save himself. The silence that followed was total, suffocating, and absolute. There was no screaming, no shattering of porcelain, no dramatic slaps. The marriage simply bled out on the Persian rug, quiet and cold. What happens now? She asked, staring at her trembling hands, terrified of the answer. Alaric reached into his tailored jacket pocket. Now, he said, pulling out a single, neatly folded document. We finalized the paperwork. The document Alaric placed on the glass coffee table was bound in thick navy cardstock. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a flawlessly executed legal surrender. The divorce decree had been drafted days ago, sitting in his briefcase while they slept in the same bed and smiled at the same gala. Alethea stared at it. She reached out with trembling fingers, opening to the final page where a line of blue ink was required to end 7 years of shared history. The prenup had been enforced with ruthless precision. She was given the Back Bay brownstone and a quiet severance. But there was an unwritten cost engineered by Odette's PR web. While Alethea's name was deliberately kept out of the federal indictment to protect Alaric's pride, the whispers in Boston's elite circles were already deafening. By tomorrow, she would be quietly asked to step down from the Preservation Society. Her architectural firm would distance themselves from the ensuing scandal. She was keeping the gilded cage, but the world outside of it had been locked away from her forever. You're letting me keep the house? She asked, her voice a hollow, broken rasp. It's just real estate, Alethea, Alaric replied, his tone entirely devoid of affection. I have no desire to live in a museum dedicated to a dead marriage. The memories here belong to you and Julian now. Alethea closed her eyes, a fresh wave of silent agony washing over her. She reached for the silver pen resting on the table. Her hand shook violently, but she forced the nib to the thick paper. The scratching sound of her signature felt like a physical blade, cleanly severing the final tether between them. Alaric watched her sign, waiting for the surge of triumph to finally arrive. He had won the war. He had secured the Vanguard merger, annihilated his greatest corporate rival, and surgically removed a traitor from his home. He was the undisputed king of his empire. Yet, standing in the quiet living room smelling faintly of fig and extinguished candles, he felt absolutely nothing. The victory was made of ash. He realized, with a cold, terrifying clarity, that to destroy the monsters in his life, he had been forced to kill the last, vulnerable pieces of his own humanity. He looked down at his left hand. The platinum wedding band caught the dim light of the chandelier. For 7 years, it had been a symbol of his greatest achievement, a partnership built on mutual respect and unwavering loyalty. Now, it was just a shackle binding him to a lie. Slowly, deliberately, Alaric gripped the ring. It slid over his knuckle, holding the fading residual warmth of his own skin. Without a word, he lowered his hand and placed the ring on the glass table, setting it down perfectly aligned with the wet ink of her signature. It made a sharp, final clink that echoed in the silent room. He didn't look at her face again. He turned his back on his wife, walking toward the foyer with measured, even steps. He picked up his leather briefcase, slipping his arms into his tailored wool coat. The silence of the house pressed against his back, heavy with the weight of her muffled, desperate sobbing. Opening the heavy mahogany front door, the freezing Boston wind immediately swept into the entryway, biting at his face. He paused on the threshold, staring out at the dark, rain-slicked street. "The house is yours, Alethea," Alaric said, his voice drifting back over his shoulder, cold and absolute into the empty hall. "But the life you thought you had, I'm taking that with me." He stepped out into the night, pulling the door shut behind him, walking away into a perfect, solitary darkness.